In the scorching dust of southern Italy, where the air seemed to cut the lungs, thousands of Roman warriors marched in complete silence. Their armor creaked from the salt of sweat, their feet sank in the road dust, and under their fingernails, blood. 2,000 years ago, this was not just a campaign. It was an ordeal that broke bodies and spirits. 1,000 kilometers in 30 days. And for those who fell behind, not mercy awaited, but death. The question that still troubles historians: why did Rome force its people to walk to the last step, even when every step became torture? Historians wrote that such marches were not uncommon during the late Republic and early Empire. One of the most famous was the movement of Gaius Julius Caesar's troops during the Gallic Wars, when legions covered hundreds of kilometers to catch the enemy by surprise. According to Polybius, Roman soldiers could march up to 30 kilometers a day in full armor. But there were instances when this distance reached 40 or more, literally a death march. When the bronze plates of chainmail dug into shoulders and the skin under helmet straps turned into sores, even the strongest began to tremble. Thus began the Iter Magnum, the Great March, a special form of military movement where no mercy existed. This term, found in Roman sources, signified not just a path, but a harsh test of discipline, will, and loyalty. Imagine rows of legionaries marching at a uniform pace, not for beauty but for survival. For any disruption of the rhythm could cause chaos. Dust, like smoke over a battlefield, settled on their faces. The smell of sweat, blood, and iron mingled into one. Someone fell and did not get up. Someone walked, gritting their teeth, because they knew to be left behind meant to die not by an enemy's sword, but by the contempt of their own. At that moment, each warrior turned into a part of a machine that does not stop. This was not just a legion. It was a living organism where the weakness of one could kill many. The centurion, a senior officer commanding 100 soldiers, walked alongside, closely watching every step. His gaze was cold, but in that gaze lay the essence of Rome: to endure at any cost. According to archaeological findings, the weight of a legionary's equipment reached 30 kilograms. Metal armor, a pilum, a heavy throwing spear, a gladius, a short sword, a shield, a cooking pot, food for several days, a tent, even tools for fortifying the camp. All of this on their backs. They called themselves Muli Mariani, Marius's mules, in honor of the reformer Gaius Marius, who first obliged soldiers to carry all their gear themselves. Thus vanished the luxury of baggage trains, and the era of marching monsters began. People capable of traversing from sea to mountains without sleep or rest. With each kilometer, the road transformed into a trial. By day, inferno. By night, cold and the hum of cicadas. But Caesar knew no mercy for fatigue. He wrote that discipline is what turns a crowd into an army. And this discipline was born not on the battlefield, but on the road. Every step brought them closer to their goal, but no one knew where the end was. And precisely in this lay the Roman paradox. An empire that created roads made them instruments of suffering. The roads along which the victors marched became the roads of martyrs, and yet despite the pain and blood, they marched on, because they knew, in Rome there was no mercy for those who weakened. Those who fell were left behind. Those who survived became part of the legend, and it was this legend, born in dust and sweat, that was only just beginning its journey. Before the start of each great march, the Roman army prepared as if they were not going on a campaign, but into eternity. At dawn, when the air was still cold but the sky was already stained with the blood of the sun, centurions inspected the ranks. The clang of metal, shouts of commands, and clatter of shields could be heard. And then the most dreadful part began: the distribution of loads, unevenly, not by chance. The more experienced the soldier, the heavier the burden. Such was Roman justice. A legionary carried on his back not only weapons but also his own shadow, everything that could save or kill. According to archaeologists' estimates, the total weight of equipment reached 40 kilograms. Armor, sword, spear, large shield, provisions, tools, stakes for fortifications, even a cooking pot. All of this hung on a wooden carrying pole slung over the shoulder. Soldiers called this implement a furca, fork, a symbol of Roman endurance. The assembly of the legion itself before a march resembled a ritual. Everyone knew their place. At the front marched the scouts, speculators, lean, enduring warriors, capable of noticing enemy traces where others saw only dust. Behind them, engineers, then legionnaires, and behind them the baggage train with supplies of grain and oil. Officers and cavalry brought up the rear of the column, ensuring no one fell behind. If someone fell, they were lifted not for assistance, but for punishment. Rome knew no pity for the weak, but the cruelty had meaning. Without discipline, an army perished faster than from an enemy's swords. Tacitus wrote, "Order saves, even when the gods turn away." This was a principle hammered into the flesh of every soldier. And so, silence reigned on the march, only the rhythmic tramp and creak of armor. The first trial began after several hours of travel. When the sun rose, the heat enveloped the legion like a burning cloak. The air shimmered, sand stuck to their lips. The warriors struggled for breath, their lips cracked, armor burned their skin. Each step turned into a battle with the body. Thus began a true Roman march. Soldiers called this process iter, which meant path. But this path rarely led to peace, sometimes to death. Those who fell without permission to stop received the punishment of fustuarium, beating with sticks to death by their own comrades. This was not just an execution, but a demonstration. No one should be weaker than the formation. Archaeological studies of the Appian Way roads show Roman marches took place on perfectly laid slabs, but this did not ease the journey. The stone reflected the heat, rendering footwear useless, skin burned, feet blistered. That is why legionaries wrapped their feet in grease-smeared rags to somehow endure the fire underfoot. And yet, despite the pain, order reigned in the ranks. The reason? An iron system of signals. 1 sound of the horn, halt. 2, formation. 3, advance. This instrument was called a tuba, a bronze horn, a voice that subjugated thousands. Even in a storm or a dust storm, this sound was audible, and the legion continued to march as a single body. But the most terrifying were not the heat and fatigue. The hardest, the night. After 20, sometimes 30 kilometers, soldiers set up camp. Without rest, without sleep. Each pitched a tent, dug a ditch, erected a rampart. Thus was created the castrum, a Roman marching camp. Strict geometry, straight streets, 4 exits, always facing the cardinal directions. Even here, order. Even after an exhausting day, discipline. One Roman historian wrote that a soldier of Rome learned to fight with a shovel earlier than with a sword. And this was true. A legionary unable to build a camp was considered useless, because for Rome survival was part of strategy, not weakness. When the camp was completed, when torches illuminated the corners, a short supper began. Spelt bread, a little oil, water, sometimes wine if there was success. This ration was called cibus militaris. Meager but sufficient to last until the next day. And again the march, again the road, again the trial. Thus passed the preparation for the great journey. And in this preparation, tragedy was already hidden. For no one knew who would reach the end. The body survived as long as it obeyed the mind, and the mind the command. When the Roman legion set out, it wasn't merely marching for glory. It marched to test where the line lay between man and machine, between will and death. And as dawn painted the sky, the column came alive once more. The trumpet signal, footsteps, the breathing of 1,000 chests. Rome began to move. And the world submitted to this movement. The start of the march always felt like a sentence. When the bronze tuba sounded, the earth seemed to hold its breath. Legionaries lifted their carrying poles with gear, tightened their straps, straightened their backs, and marched. Not a word, not a complaint. Only the muffled rhythm of footsteps and the clatter of metal. Everyone knew if you hesitated, you would fall under the wheels of history. The movement began at dawn. Commanders arrayed the soldiers in strict order. The vanguard went first, the best fighters, then the center, where the standards were carried, and the heavy baggage train brought up the rear of the column. The entire mass of the legion could stretch for several kilometers. Polybius wrote that the column of the Roman army, if deployed in marching formation, stretched like a living snake, a shimmering scale of shields and spears. This spectacle instilled terror even in allies. The first day was always the most brutal. The body had not yet adjusted to the rhythm. Feet burned, shoulders ached. Soldiers knew if you couldn't endure the first 100 kilometers, you wouldn't endure at all. Therefore, the first days were called dies ferrum, days of iron. It was then that the essence of the legion was revealed, not strength, but endurance. The Romans had a term for the formation in which they marched in a column, strictly maintaining pace: agmen. This word meant more than just movement. It was a symbol of coordination, when hundreds of bodies moved as a single mechanism. No talking, only the sounds of footsteps and breathing. In such marches, a strength was born that enemies later called invincible. But this path was torment. At midday, the air above the stones shimmered like over a blacksmith's forge. Chainmail became hot as coals, straps dug into skin, backs burned. Some legionaries tried to protect themselves. They cut out wool pads, rubbed their bodies with fat, but nothing helped. Even when their lips cracked from thirst, they couldn't drink without an order: water, only upon signal. Thus, loyalty was tested. The centurion walked alongside, watching the formation. His voice could suddenly ring out, a short command, sharp as the crack of a whip. Sometimes he raised his staff, the vitus, a symbol of authority, and struck the back of anyone who fell out of step, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. For if one person faltered, another nearby could fall. And then the entire formation lost its rhythm. Rome hated chaos. By midday, the warriors lost track of time. The only reference point was the sound of the trumpet, the signal to halt. Then the entire legion stopped as one body. And in this silence, amidst the dust and heat, one could hear someone fall, sometimes forever. No one lifted the fallen. Only the evening guard collected their bodies and buried them on the roadside. Archaeologists still find these graves today, without names, without inscriptions, only fragments of footwear and iron clasps. By evening, their feet turned into wounds. The skin on their soles peeled off in layers. Then the warriors tied pieces of cloth soaked in vinegar to their feet. It burned, but it killed infection. Thus they saved themselves from gangrene. This method was even mentioned by Vegetus, a military writer who described how endurance saved an army from destruction. When the legion approached mountain passes, another torture began: cold. In the mountains of Italy, nights were icy, and armor turned into a frosty shell. Beneath it, steam. Beneath the steam, wounds. But no one removed their armor. To remove it meant not being ready for battle. Even sleep was short: 3 hours, then a change of guard. Sometimes local residents were encountered along the way. They came out to watch the legion as if it were a miracle. A massive column of men in steel, moving in absolute silence. Children were forbidden to shout. It was said that Romans could hear fear, but not only fear accompanied these warriors. Somewhere deep inside, another feeling grew: pride. Each understood that he walked a road trodden by his ancestors. These roads, viae, were the arteries of the empire, and to walk on them meant to be part of something eternal. And yet, not everyone reached the end. According to modern historians, losses in long marches could reach 10% of the personnel. This was not an enemy, not disease, just the road. The burden, heat, fatigue. Rome paid with lives for movement, but it was precisely this movement that created the empire. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, the trumpet sounded again, the signal to halt. The warriors formed ranks, set up camp, planted their standards into the ground. One day ended, another began, and each new day was a step towards the limits of human capability. And somewhere ahead, beyond the dust of the horizon, what would be remembered as a true Roman death march was already beginning. By the fourth week of the journey, Rome ceased to be a city for them. It became an idea. Everything that surrounded the legionaries was reduced to the road, the steppe, and the pain. With each morning, the number of warriors dwindled. Some died from exhaustion, some from heat or disease, some simply vanished at night, unable to endure. But no one dared to speak of loss. In formation, one could not even utter the name of the deceased. Their place was taken by the next. Roman chronicles report that up to 6,000 men could be sent on such campaigns. Of these, half returned. And although the exact figures remain a subject of debate, all agree. Survival required not only the body, but also a steel mind. Modern psychologists would call this March trance, when a person ceases to feel pain and moves by inertia. Romans called this constantia, steadfastness of spirit, one of the main military virtues. The one who walked alongside was no longer a comrade. He was a mirror of your weakness. Any attempt to help could cost both their lives. When someone fell, the others merely clenched their teeth tighter and marched on. This was not cruelty, but law. According to Livy, a Roman soldier had to fear disgrace more than death. By the 30th day of the march, their legs disobeyed, their minds blurred. Each step became a challenge to oneself. Warriors who had lost strength, to avoid falling, clung to their spears as if to crutches. Some tied their shields to their backs with straps so as not to carry them in their hands. But the most terrifying began when water disappeared. According to the descriptions of ancient authors, the column could pass through dried-up valleys where the sun scorched all living things. Then water turned into a value more precious than gold. It was divided by the handful, by the drop. If someone tried to drink without permission, the punishment was one: death. Water belonged not to the individual, but to the legion. To somewhat alleviate suffering, warriors rubbed their bodies with sand so that sweat evaporated slower. It smelled of blood, iron, and sweat. Traces were left on the skin from the armor like burns. Archaeologists found these marks on the remains, traces of straps and clasps dug into the bone. Even skeletons bear witness to how unbearable these crossings were. Under such conditions, even officers had no privileges. The legate, commander of the legion, marched together with his soldiers. His tent was pitched in the center of the camp, but during the march he carried the same burden. Roman valor tolerated no distinctions. The commander had to suffer alongside his subordinates. It was precisely this that evoked fanatical loyalty. One of the most important elements of the march was the signum, the legion's standard. It was carried by the signifier, a warrior whose life was worth more than dozens of others. To lose the standard meant to lose honor. And even if he died from exhaustion, others continued to carry the standard so that it would not fall into the dust. Appian wrote that during long marches, warriors often looked not at the road, but at the standard, as a beacon, as a reminder of what they were marching for. But exhaustion was not the only enemy. In the mountains, on slopes and passes, legionaries had to contend with cold and rain. Heavy chainmail became saturated with water, growing even heavier. Sometimes armor froze to the skin. Soldiers lit fires to dry themselves and their weapons, but the smoke suffocated and rest time was short. Centurions forced them to move again, for a stationary legion was a dead legion. Sometimes they marched at night to avoid the heat. Then the road turned into a nightmare. Only the flickering of torches, the muffled thud of footsteps, and shadows gliding along the verges. In the darkness, it was easy to lose formation, but even then, silence was maintained. Rome did not allow itself chaos even in pitch blackness. Archaeological research shows that on the routes of such crossings, fragments of footwear, spearheads, and charred bones are often found. All of these are traces of people who, did not make it. Historians debate whether this march was an attempt at military demonstration or a desperate flight. But one thing is known for sure: it became a symbol of endurance that transformed men into legend. With each passing day, the legion turned into a shadow of itself. From 6,000, 4 remained, then 3. Faces were covered with salty sweat, eyes reddened from dust. Breathing became a whistle. But each knew, if you fall, they will not pick you up. If you survive, you will become part of eternity. And when at last the walls of the nearest fortification appeared, no one rejoiced. Joy had left with weakness. Only emptiness remained, cold, heavy, like iron. The Roman death march ended not in victory, but in silence. But it was this silence that made Rome immortal. When the last detachments of legionaries reached the end of the journey, the ground beneath their feet no longer felt solid. It seemed alive, breathing pain. Each step echoed in their bones like a hammer blow. People walked, driven solely by memories of duty. 30 days of travel, 1,000 kilometers, and every meter saturated with sweat and blood. But Rome offered no rest. Even here, at the finish line, a new discipline began: the testing of the living. The first days after the march were considered the most dangerous. The body refused to obey, but it was then that parades and roll calls began. Officers counted the survivors, compiled reports, noted losses. Of 6,000 soldiers, according to the records of ancient authors, just over 4,000 might return. The rest remained on the roads, without gravestones or memory. But in Rome, they thought differently. The fallen did not vanish. They gave their body for the sake of order. At this stage, the true culmination began, a test not of the body, but of the spirit. Exhausted warriors had to build fortifications, erect a camp, and be ready for attack. No one had the right to collapse, even after a month of continuous movement. Commanders tested not only discipline, but also faith, in Rome, in the legion, in themselves. This faith was called virtus, valor, virtue, an inner steel that turned a soldier into a symbol. Archaeologists studying Roman fortifications in the northern Campania region found traces of fires in which charcoal and charred bones were mixed. Apparently, some of the deceased were simply burned to avoid infecting others. This smell, mixed with the acrid scent of metal, hung over the camps for weeks. Death in Rome was not a tragedy. It was order. Centurions, whose ranks had thinned, walked through the formation in silence. Their Vitus staffs no longer rose for punishments. No one was left to punish. Only eyes, red from fatigue, watched to ensure that those remaining stood straight. He who survived did not boast. He simply breathed. And yet it was this very breathing that became proof that Rome's iron machine was still functioning. Historians believe that such marches were not only a test of endurance, but also a method of psychological toughening. According to Goldsworthy, the Roman army did not believe in rest. It believed in the habit of suffering. A soldier had to be ready for the fact that the enemy was not a man, but the road itself. And he who conquered the road would conquer everything else. At night, when the camp plunged into silence, one could hear coughing and groans, but no one spoke of pain. The warriors merely sharpened their blades, short gladii, already rusty from sweat and rain. For them, it was a ritual, a way to remind themselves that it was all for a reason. For the path was not merely a movement towards a goal. It was an act of sacrifice, and sacrifice demanded awareness. Among the finds related to such crossings, archaeologists often discover small figures of gods: Mars, Mercury, Hercules. Soldiers carried them in pouches, like amulets. Perhaps this was the only thing that gave them hope. And when, after the march, such figures were placed on the ground, it meant that the prayer had been heard. They had survived. The legate, commander of the legion, gave the order to record the names of the survivors on tablets, tabulae militum. These records were kept at headquarters, and everyone who reached the end received a mark equivalent to a military award, but not with money, not with land, but with glory. Rome considered glory a form of immortality, and thus every step, every lost comrade became part of that immortality. Tacitus wrote that the Romans undertook the hardest marches not for victories, but for memory. Because memory in Rome was a form of power, a legion that endured a death march was considered chosen. It was placed in the vanguard in future battles. Its name was heard in the Senate. This was a paradox, suffering as a path to glory. When finally a day of rest came, the warriors removed their armor, and for the first time in a month felt their own bodies. Scars, sores, bruises, all became part of their new skin. But no one complained. In each eye reflected emptiness, but also pride. They had made it. They had proven that a man can be tougher than iron. And yet, amidst this silent triumph, a question lingered that has not subsided to this day. For what? For what did the empire force its people to go to the limit, when every mile turned into torture? Perhaps the answer was simple. Rome believed that only he who is capable of conquering himself is worthy of ruling the world. And in this belief lay a great price. Because the road along which the legionaries marched led not only to glory, it led to the boundary of human capabilities. And beyond that boundary began what would later be called the immortality of the empire. At dawn, when the first ray of sun cut through the fog, the legion stood in formation again. No drums, no fanfares, only the breathing of hundreds of people who had survived against all odds. They looked forward to where a new road began. The commander uttered no speeches. In Rome, the word rest did not exist. Only forward movement, as long as the body held the spear. On the parade ground lay piles of the fallen's weapons, swords without owners, broken spears, shields with faded emblems. They were not taken away. A Roman had no right to personal memory. Everything belonged to the legion. In the evening, these relics would be burned in a single pyre, and the ashes scattered to the wind. Thus the weak vanished, and thus legend was born. Some of the survivors later wrote, "The most terrible part began not on the road, but after it, when it suddenly became quiet, when muscles, accustomed to pain, did not know what to do without it. This peace drove them mad, and many asked for a new campaign, just not to hear their own thoughts." Rome did not create heroes. It forged a mechanism. Each warrior was a part, each step a cog in a vast machine. And that is why the empire endured for centuries. It fed on the suffering of its soldiers. And if the road was their hell, then Rome was their heaven, cold, merciless, eternal. When the sun had fully risen, the legion moved forward again. Dust rose, obscuring the ground, and it seemed as if not an army was marching, but history itself.